Hey guys, tonight we were going to pull the plug on a few romantic myths and wade into the murky waters of medieval hygiene. Specifically, we're going to explore the strange, suspicious, and often downright disgusting bathing habits of the Middle Ages. You might picture knights returning from crusades and sinking into steaming, herb-scented tubs, but the reality for most was far less cinematic and infinitely more uncomfortable. It was an era where the very act of washing was considered a medical risk, where your clothes were cleaner than your skin, where the most popular fragrance was often just a blend of hope and desperation. We'll uncover why people feared water, what they used instead of soap, and how an entire civilization navigated life without the simple comforts we take for granted. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's always wonderful to see how far our community of night owls stretches. So please, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And if these quiet explorations of the past help you unwind, do consider subscribing for more. Imagine for a moment that you are waking up. It isn't the gentle chime of an alarm that stirs you, but the insistent clang of a distant church bell and the chilling draft that has found the one tiny gap in your wool blanket. You are lying on a straw-stuffed mattress, a lumpy landscape that has, over the seasons, become intimately acquainted with your every ache. The air in the single-room hut is a complex symphony of odors. Wood smoke, damp earth, the sour tang of fermenting ale, and the ever-present oddly comforting scent of the family goat, who is currently chewing thoughtfully on a corner of your blanket. You feel a layer of grime on your skin, a souvenir from yesterday's labor, and the simple reality of sleeping in your clothes. The thought of a bath, a stream of hot water to wash away the night's chill and the day's toil, is a fantasy as remote as a king's treasure. For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, bathing was not a daily ritual. It wasn't even a weekly one. Mainstream historical fact is that full immersion bathing was an infrequent and often seasonally dependent activity, especially for the peasantry. Lacking the infrastructure for heated water, private tubs, and the time to spare from endless labor, the average person, as concept of washing, was limited to a quick splash of cold water on the hands and face. A full bath, if it happened at all, was a major event, perhaps undertaken a few times a year. The rest of the time, you simply accumulated the evidence of your life on your skin. This leads to a peculiar and little-known detail: the social significance of hand washing. While full-body bathing was rare, washing one's hands before and after a meal was a crucial marker of good manners among the nobility and even the aspiring merchant classes. Servants would bring bowls of scented water and towels to guests at feasts. This wasn't about germ theory, which was centuries away, but about ritual and courtesy. It was a public performance of cleanliness. You might be covered in a fine layer of dust and sweat under your tunic, but as long as your hands were clean before you reached for the bread, your social standing was secure. It was a fascinatingly selective approach to hygiene, where the visible parts mattered more than the whole. A clean hand could mask a world of grime. This reality has sparked a long-standing academic debate. Was the medieval avoidance of bathing a result of technological limitations or a genuine cultural phobia of water? The older historical viewpoint often emphasized the practicalities. People didn't bathe because it was incredibly difficult. You needed to haul water, gather precious firewood to heat it, and use a cumbersome wooden tub that probably leaked. It was a luxury few could afford in terms of time or resources. However, a more recent school of thought places greater emphasis on the medical beliefs of the time. Leading physicians, following ancient Greek theories, taught that hot water opened the skin's pores, making the body vulnerable to miasma or bad air, which was believed to carry disease. In this view, avoiding baths was an act of self-preservation. You weren't being dirty, you were being careful. This debate is ongoing, but it's now widely accepted that a combination of both factors was at play. Bathing was not only a logistical nightmare, but was also viewed with deep suspicion by a society that believed sickness could literally seep into you through your clean, open pores. It's a bit of a dry joke, but your doctor might have actually prescribed you less bathing to protect your health. And so, you lie there in your smoky hut, feeling the familiar itch of wool and flea, and you don't dream of a bath. You dream of a slightly thicker blanket. You've accepted that a full, luxurious bath is off the table, a fantasy reserved for nobles with too much time and firewood. Instead, your morning cleansing ritual is a testament to medieval pragmatism. It is brief, it is cold, and it is focused entirely on the parts of you the rest of the village is most likely to see. You stumble over to a wooden bucket near the door, which holds the water you hauled from the well yesterday. Dipping your hands into the icy liquid, you gasp. The shock of the cold is a brutal but effective way to wake up. You splash your face, rubbing away the sleep and the faint layer of soot from the fire that seems to settle on everything overnight. You might use a coarse linen cloth to scrub, but soap is a rare luxury. For most, the cleaning agent is simply friction and frigid water. This limited washing was the standard for centuries. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was centered on social presentation rather than microbial cleanliness. Since people didn't understand germs, the focus was on removing visible dirt from the hands and face, the parts of the body presented in public. It was a gesture of civility. At a lord's table, ewers and basins were passed around for hand washing before the meal, a ritual that demonstrated refinement. What lay beneath one's tunic was a private matter, and as long as your hands were clean enough to share a loaf of bread, you were considered socially acceptable. This is why medieval art so often depicts people with clean faces and hands, even if the world around them was mired in filth. It reflected their ideal, not necessarily their reality. This selective approach led to some curious little-known practices. Without full body washing, how did people manage body odor? The answer lay in herbs and linens. It was widely believed that wearing a clean linen undertunic, or shift, was a form of cleaning in itself. The linen was thought to draw out the dirt and sweat from the body. The wealthy would change these shifts daily, considering the act a substitute for a full bath. For the less fortunate, a single shift might be worn for a week or more. To combat odors, people tucked sachets of dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint into their clothing or bed straw. Pomanders, which were metal balls filled with aromatic substances like ambergris or musk, were a popular accessory for the rich. Held to the nose in smelly situations to ward off both bad smells and the diseases they were thought to carry. In a way, medieval hygiene was less about removal and more about masterful concealment. This brings us to an academic debate concerning the role of the church in hygiene. The traditional narrative often portrays the church as being actively hostile to bathing, associating it with Roman decadence and immorality. The closure of many public bathhouses was often blamed on clerical condemnation, with priests viewing them as dens of sin and promiscuity. There is certainly evidence to support this. Many sermons from the period warned against the temptations of the flesh and the vanity associated with excessive grooming. However, a more revisionist historical perspective argues that the church's stance was far more complex. Some monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and Cistercians, were pioneers of sophisticated water management systems. With designated lavers for washing and a strong emphasis on hand washing before prayer and meals, they saw a distinction between cleanliness for health and piety and bathing for sensual pleasure. The phrase cleanliness is next to godliness is a much later invention, but some scholars argue that its roots can be found in this monastic tradition, where physical purity was seen as a reflection of spiritual purity. The debate today is not whether the church had an opinion on bathing. It certainly did, but whether its influence was uniformly negative, or if it simultaneously preserved and promoted certain forms of ritualized cleanliness while condemning others. It's a bit of a dry joke, but while a peasant might get a lecture for enjoying a public bath, a monk was praised for having the cleanest hands in the abbey. It was all about the intention. And so, you finish your morning splash, your face tingling and red from the cold water, and you are, for all intents and purposes, clean enough for the day ahead. Your hands and face are clean, or at least medieval clean. But the very idea of submerging your entire body in water fills you with a sense of unease. It's not just the biting cold or the sheer effort of it all. It's a deeper, more ingrained suspicion. A fear taught by physicians, whispered by neighbors, and confirmed by the ever-present threat of plague. In the medieval mind, the greatest danger of bathing wasn't the risk of catching a chill. It was the risk of letting death itself seep into your very pores. This leads us to one of the most significant mainstream historical facts about medieval hygiene: the influence of miasma theory. For centuries, the prevailing medical belief inherited from ancient Greece and Rome was that many diseases, including the dreaded plague, were caused by miasma, or bad air. This was thought to be a toxic vapor rising from swamps, rotting organic matter, and other foul-smelling places. It was believed that this poisonous air could enter the body through the nose, the mouth, or, most terrifyingly, through the pores of the skin. When they were opened by warm water, a hot bath, therefore, was seen as a medically reckless act. You were essentially opening the gates of your body's fortress and inviting the enemy in. Physicians of the era wrote extensively on this danger, advising patients to avoid bathing, especially during epidemics. To keep their bodies sealed against the invisible pestilence that drifted on the breeze. This fear was so profound that after the Black Death ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, the practice of public bathing, which had been relatively common, went into a steep decline. This fear gave rise to some truly bizarre and little-known preventative measures. Bad air was the enemy, then good auror, at least strong-smelling air, was the shield. People went to extraordinary lengths to surround themselves with powerful scents to counteract the miasma. The wealthy carried pomanders, small, ornate containers filled with aromatic substances like musk, ambergris, cloves, and other spices. They would hold these to their noses when walking through crowded streets or visiting the sick, believing the pleasant fragrance would form a protective barrier against the deadly stenches. During plague outbreaks, physicians wore their now iconic beak-like masks. The beak was not just for show. It was stuffed with herbs, spices, and straw, acting as a primitive respirator designed to filter out the miasma. Bonfires of aromatic woods like juniper or rosemary were often lit in town squares to purify the air. In a world without germ theory, the fight against disease was a battle of smells, a fragrant war waged against an invisible, foul-smelling foe. This understanding of disease has led to a fascinating academic debate. Did medieval hygiene practices or the lack thereof actually make epidemics like the Black Death worse? The traditional argument is a resounding yes. The lack of sanitation, the filth in the streets which attracted rats, and their fleas, and the crowded, unhygienic living conditions are all seen as primary factors in the plague's devastatingly rapid spread. From this perspective, their fear of bathing and their ignorance of germs created the perfect storm for a pandemic. However, some revisionist historians have proposed a more complicated view. They argue that while the lack of sanitation was certainly a major factor, the advice to avoid bathing might have, in a strange and accidental way, offered a tiny bit of protection. Public bathhouses, with their shared water and warm, damp conditions, could have been breeding grounds for other diseases. Avoiding them might have limited the spread of certain infections, even if the reasoning was based on flawed medical theory. Furthermore, the emphasis on changing linen shifts, which was seen as a form of dry cleaning, might have helped reduce lice and flea infestations to some small degree. The debate isn't about whether medieval hygiene was good, it was objectively terrible by modern standards, but about whether all of their practices were uniformly detrimental, or if some of their misguided attempts at health accidentally blundered into a minor occasional benefit. It's a grim joke, but by trying to protect themselves from bad air, they may have occasionally, and for all the wrong reasons, protected themselves from each other. But ultimately, when faced with the Yersinia pestis bacterium, a face full of herbs and a fear of open pores stood little chance. Despite the medical anxieties surrounding water, there was a time, especially in the earlier medieval period, when bathing was a surprisingly public and social affair. Before the Black Death instilled a widespread fear of contagion, many European towns and cities boasted public bathhouses, or stews, that were central to the community's social life. These establishments were a far cry from a private, sterile bathroom. They were lively, noisy, and offered much more than just a hot soak. A mainstream historical fact is that these medieval bathhouses were complex social centers, a legacy inherited from the Roman tradition. Patrons didn't just go to get clean. They went to relax, to socialize, to do business, and to be entertained. A typical bathhouse might have several tubs of varying temperatures, steam rooms, and areas for massage. But that was just the beginning. Attendants, known as bagnards, would offer services like haircutting, shaving, and even minor medical procedures like bloodletting or tooth pulling, solidifying the barber surgeon's link to the bathing world. Food and drink were readily available. It was common for people to conduct business meetings or sealed deals while lounging in the tubs. Minstrels often played music, and the atmosphere was one of leisurely indulgence. For a small fee, anyone from a merchant to a craftsman could escape the grime and chill of the city streets and enjoy a few hours of warm, convivial relaxation, as public often co-ed. Environment inevitably led to a little-known aspect of bathhouse culture. Their reputation as hubs of amoral and illicit activity, the term stews became synonymous not just with steam, but with brothels. The warm, intimate, and alcohol-fueled setting was a natural place for flirtation and courtship, but it also became a haven for prostitution. This gave the church, which was already wary of bodily vanity and worldly pleasures, a powerful reason to condemn them. Moralists and preachers railed against the bathhouses, painting them as dens of sin where decent people risked both their mortal souls and their physical health. The association with promiscuity was so strong that by the 15th and 16th centuries, many towns had either shut down their bathhouses or heavily regulated them, transforming them from community centers into something far more seedy and marginalized. This has fueled a long-running academic debate. Were medieval bathhouses primarily places of hygiene and social bonding, or were they fundamentally fronts for vice? The traditional view, heavily influenced by later moralistic critiques, tended to emphasize the scandalous side. It painted a picture of debauchery and sin, suggesting that any hygienic benefits were secondary to their role in the medieval underworld. However, more recent scholarship has pushed back against this, arguing that we shouldn't judge an entire institution by its most notorious elements. Proponents of this view point to guild regulations and town records that show many bathhouses were respectable, family-run businesses that played an important role in public health, such as it was. They argue that for every bathhouse that doubled as a brothel, there were many more that simply offered a warm, clean place for the community to gather. The modern consensus is that the reality was diverse. Some bathhouses were undoubtedly seedy, but many others were legitimate social institutions. The stews weren't one thing. They were a reflection of the full spectrum of medieval urban life, from the pious to the profane. It's a bit of a dry joke, but you could get a bath, a shave, a business deal, and a moral lecture all in the same afternoon. Eventually, the combination of moral condemnation from the church and the medical fears following the plague proved too much for the public bathhouse. Their decline marked a significant shift in European hygiene, moving cleanliness from a public, social activity to a private and much rarer one. The world of the shared tub, the steam-filled rooms, and the convivial chatter faded away, replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of water and a reliance on linen and perfume. For centuries, the bath would be seen not as a source of health and community, but as one of danger and temptation. While the common peasant could only dream of a hot bath for the medieval nobility, bathing was a rare, but incredibly elaborate ritual, a symbol of status, luxury, and power. It was less about daily hygiene and more about performance art. When a lord or lady decided to bathe, it was a major event that involved a small army of servants and a dizzying display of wealth. Forget a quick shower. A noble's bath was an all-afternoon affair, a testament to a life lived without the burden of manual labor or hurry. The process began with the tub itself. This was not a built-in porcelain fixture, but a large portable wooden barrel, often big enough for 2 people. A mainstream historical fact is that these tubs were frequently lined with a clean linen cloth to protect the bather from splinters and to add a touch of comfort. The tub would be placed in a private chamber, usually near a roaring fireplace, to combat the castle's perpetual bone-deep chill. Sometimes a canopy or tent was erected over the tub to trap the steam and create a more intimate spa-like atmosphere. It was, in effect, a pop-up bathroom assembled on demand. Then came the most labor-intensive part, the water. Servants would have to haul dozens of buckets of water from the castle well or a nearby river, heat them over a kitchen fire, and then lug the steaming buckets up flights of stone stairs to fill the tub. This alone was an enormous expenditure of labor and precious firewood. This is a key reason why bathing was so infrequent. The resources required were immense. Once the tub was filled, the bath could be customized. This is a fascinating, little-known detail of aristocratic life. Sweet-smelling herbs, flowers like roses and chamomile, or fragrant oils would be scattered into the water, transforming it into a luxurious, aromatic soak. This wasn't just for a pleasant scent. These botanicals were believed to have medicinal properties capable of balancing the body's humors and soothing the nerves. The bather would be provided with fine soap, if available a soft soap made from mutton fat, and would shand high-quality linen cloths for washing. This luxurious experience has fueled an academic debate about the purpose of the noble bath. So, was it truly for cleanliness, or was it primarily a social and political tool? The traditional view saw these baths as a simple, if extravagant, act of hygiene. However, a more contemporary perspective argues that the bath was a stage for displaying status and conducting intimate social interactions. It was not uncommon for a lord to receive guests or hold informal meetings while in his tub. Sharing a bath was a sign of great trust and intimacy, a way to forge alliances or engage in discreet negotiations away from the prying ears of the main court. There are even accounts of meals being served on wooden trays that floated in the tub. A joke from the era might have been, "I closed the deal with the Duke of Burgundy over a bowl of soup and a good scrub." This view reframes the noble bath not just as an act of personal care, but as a carefully managed performance of power and privilege. When the bath was over, the luxury continued. Servants would be waiting with large, warm linen towels to dry the bather, who would then be anointed with expensive perfumes and oils imported from the East. Dressed in a fresh, clean robe, they would emerge from the chamber, not just cleaner, but symbolically renewed and reinforced in their elite status. For the aristocracy, a bath was the ultimate rejection of the peasant's world. It was a declaration that you had so much wealth and so many servants that you could afford to engage in this wildly impractical and resource-intensive activity. It was a statement that you did not have to live in the grime and sweat of the common folk. You were different. You were clean, at least for a day. Far from the steam-filled chambers and herb-scented tubs of the nobility, your life as a medieval peasant offers a starkly different relationship with water. For you, a bath is not a luxury. It is a swift, shivering, and profoundly practical encounter with nature. There is no army of servants, no roaring fireplace, and certainly no canopy to trap the heat. There is just you, a nearby body of water, and the dawning realization that this is going to be very, very cold. For the vast majority of the year, the idea of a full body wash is a distant dream. But during the brief, warm months of summer, a dip in the local river or stream becomes a possibility. A mainstream historical fact is that for the peasantry, natural waterways served as their communal bathtub. On a hot day, after long hours of sweating in the fields, the entire village might head to the riverbank. It was a multi-purpose event. You could wash your body, scrub your single tunic, and water the livestock. All in the same convenient, if slightly murky location. There was no soap. Cleaning was achieved through vigorous scrubbing with sand or coarse cloth, and the simple friction of the moving water. It was less a spa day and more a brisk, functional rinse. This public bathing leads to a little-known social aspect of peasant life. Riverbanks in summer became lively social hubs. It was one of the few times when the strictures of daily labor were relaxed, and people could gather with a degree of freedom. Children splashed and played. Young men and women might engage in cautious flirtation, and adults would trade gossip while beating their laundry against the rocks. Despite the church's general frowning upon public nudity, these communal bathing spots operated with a degree of practical tolerance. In the heat of summer, modesty often took a back seat to the sheer relief of cooling off. However, it was still a far cry from the indulgent bathing of the nobles. The water was often contaminated with animal waste and runoff from the fields, and the whole affair was over as quickly as it began. You got in, you scrubbed, and you got out before you caught a chill, even in summer. This reality has sparked an academic debate about the health implications of such practices. The traditional historical view often romanticized the peasant's connection to nature, suggesting that this natural lifestyle was somehow healthier or hardier. This perspective saw the peasant as robust and untroubled by the filth, their immune systems hardened by constant exposure. However, modern historians and paleopathologists have largely debunked this. They argue that bathing in contaminated rivers was a significant source of disease. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and parasitic infections would have been rampant. The very water that was supposed to clean you could also kill you. This newer perspective paints a much grimmer picture, suggesting that the peasant's bath, while socially significant, was a major public health hazard. The debate highlights the vast difference between a romanticized vision of rural life and the harsh scientific reality of pre-modern sanitation. When summer faded and the water grew too cold for even the bravest soul, bathing ceased almost entirely. For the rest of the year, cleanliness was a piecemeal affair. You might collect rainwater in a barrel for washing your hands and face. You might use melted snow. But the idea of a full wash in the depths of winter was absurd. One of the dry jokes of the time might have been that in winter, you could tell how important a person was by how little they smelled like the outdoors. For a peasant, the scent of earth, sweat, and wood smoke was a permanent part of their identity. They didn't have the luxury of perfumes or scented linens to mask the realities of a life lived without regular washing. Their hygiene was dictated not by choice, but by the seasons, the temperature of the river, and the endless pressing demands of survival. The gap between the noble in his herb-scented tub and the peasant in the muddy river was as wide and deep as the moat surrounding a castle. You find yourself standing in your small, smoky hut, the river now too cold for even a quick plunge. The memory of summer's brief cleanliness has faded, and the familiar, itchy reality of winter has set in. How do you stay clean when bathing is no longer an option? The medieval answer was surprisingly simple and wonderfully misguided. You don't wash your body, you wash your clothes. Specifically, you rely on the magical properties of your linen undergarment. For those who could afford it, the primary tool of hygiene was the linen shift, or undertunic, worn directly against the skin by both men and women. A mainstream historical fact is that it was widely believed that linen had the ability to absorb the body's filth and sweat. By changing this undergarment regularly, you were, in effect, performing a dry bath. The clean linen would supposedly draw the impurities away from your skin, leaving you fresh. The wealthy elite might change their linen shifts daily, a practice that they considered the very pinnacle of personal hygiene. This is why you see so many portraits of nobles with pristine white collars and cuffs peeking out from their opulent outer garments. That visible sliver of clean linen was a powerful status symbol, a declaration that you were clean where it counted. This belief gave rise to a fascinating and little-known laundry industry. Since washing clothes was a laborious task, professional washerwomen, or lavenders, were a common sight in towns and cities. They would gather soiled linens from wealthy households and take them to rivers or public washing areas. The process was grueling. They would beat the clothes with wooden paddles on rocks, scrub them with harsh lye-based soaps, and then lay them out in fields to be bleached by the sun. The result was brilliantly white linen, but the cost was immense, wear and tear on the fabric. A rich person's wardrobe required a constant supply of new undergarments to replace the ones destroyed by the brutal washing process. This also meant that the washerwomen themselves were constantly exposed to the filth and potential diseases of their clients. The focus on linen, as a proxy for cleanliness, has led to an academic debate. Did this practice actually improve health, or was it merely an illusion of hygiene? The traditional argument is that, while flawed, it was better than nothing. Regularly changing undergarments would have reduced the population of lice and fleas on the body, potentially lowering the transmission of insect-borne diseases like typhus. Clean linen would also be less likely to chafe the skin and cause infections. From this perspective, while they didn't understand why, their focus on clean linen had some accidental health benefits. However, a more critical modern perspective argues that this was largely a cosmetic solution that ignored the bigger problem. While the linen might have been clean, the skin underneath it was not. Bacteria and fungi would still thrive on an unwashed body, leading to a host of skin conditions. This view suggests that the clean linen theory was a convenient fiction that allowed the wealthy to feel clean. Without having to engage in the medically suspicious act of bathing, it maintained social appearances while doing little to address the underlying lack of sanitation. For you, the peasant, Even this level of hygiene is a distant luxury. You likely own only 1 or 2 woolen tunics, and perhaps a single linen shift, if you're fortunate. You wear the same garments for weeks or even months on end. Washing them is a rare event, reserved for the warmest days of summer. As winter sets in, a fascinating, if disgusting, thing happens. The layers of dirt, grease, and soot that accumulate on your woolen outer clothes actually begin to serve a purpose. They clog the weave of the fabric, making it more waterproof and wind-resistant. Your filthy tunic becomes a surprisingly effective insulator. It's a bit of a grim joke, but by not washing, you were creating your own personal, all-natural Gore-Tex. This unintended benefit highlights the peasant's pragmatic approach to life. If it keeps you warmer, you don't question the smell. In this world, your clothing isn't just a covering. It's your second skin, your insulator, and in the case of the wealthy, your bathtub. You're living in a world where a full bath is a rare and suspicious event, and your primary cleaning method is changing your shirt. Naturally, this leads to a rather pressing question. How did anyone manage to smell even remotely pleasant? The medieval answer was not to eliminate odor, but to mask it with a powerful arsenal of fragrances, herbs, and spices. In the upper echelons of society, smelling good, or at least, smelling like something other than unwashed humanity, was an obsession. This obsession fueled a vast and expensive trade in aromatic substances. A mainstream historical fact is that the demand for perfumes, incense, and spices was a major driver of the medieval economy. Connecting Europe to the distant markets of the Middle East and Asia, the wealthy would spend fortunes on exotic scents. Rosewater, imported from Persia, was used to wash hands and scent linens. Frankincense and myrrh were burned as incense, filling castle halls with a thick, sacred smoke. But the most prized fragrances were animal-derived. Musk, from the musk deer. Civet, from the civet cat. And ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales that washed ashore. These powerful musky scents were the foundation of high-end perfumery and were believed to be potent aphrodisiacs. This brings us to a little-known and fascinating object, the pomander. This was the essential accessory for any wealthy person navigating the fragrant battlefield of medieval life. A pomander was a small, ornate ball, usually made of gold or silver, designed to hold solid perfume. The ball was often perforated, allowing the scent to escape. People would carry these pomanders on a chain from their belt, or simply hold them in their hand, lifting them to their nose whenever they encountered an unpleasant odor, which was often... But the pomander had another, more critical function. In the age of miasma theory, it was believed that these strong, pleasant smells could form a protective shield against the bad air that caused disease. Inhaling the scent of your pomander wasn't just an act of sensory relief. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, an attempt to fight the plague with perfume. The widespread use of these powerful fragrances has led to an interesting academic debate. Did the medieval world truly smell worse than our own? Or was their tolerance for and perception of smells simply different? The traditional view holds that medieval Europe was an overwhelmingly foul-smelling place. The combination of non-existent sanitation, unwashed bodies, animal filth would have created a constant, staggering stench by modern standards. Proponents of this view point to the very existence of things like pomanders as proof you wouldn't need a personal air freshener if the world didn't stink.
Ow.
However, a more recent cultural and anthropological perspective suggests it's not so simple. This view argues that while the smells were certainly different, medieval people were simply habituated to them. The scent of wood smoke, livestock, and manure was the normal background smell of daily life, not necessarily an offensive one. They argue that the obsession with strong perfumes among the rich wasn't just about masking body odor, but about creating a distinct scent identity, a way to smell like wealth, power, and the exotic East, thereby setting themselves apart from the earthy smells of the peasantry. It wasn't just about smelling good, but about smelling rich. For you, the peasant, imported musk and ambergris are out of the question. Your world is scented by the earth. Combat odors with what you can grow or gather. Bundles of dried lavender, rosemary, and mint are hung from the rafters of your hut to freshen the smoky air. You might scatter sweet-smelling rushes or herbs on your dirt floor. For personal fragrance, you could rub a crushed mint leaf on your wrists or tuck a sprig of thyme into your bodice. It's a simple, fleeting solution. There's a dry joke in the fact that while a noble lady might spend a fortune to smell like a Persian garden, a peasant girl could achieve a similar, if less potent, effect for free. In the end, your scent tells the story of your life. The nobles smelled of rare spices in distant lands. You smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and honest labor. And in the complex sensory world of the Middle Ages, both were powerful statements of who you were. In a world where full body washing was a rare event, you can imagine that hair care presented its own unique set of challenges. Long, flowing, glossy hair was celebrated in medieval art and literature as a pinnacle of female beauty, a symbol of youth, fertility, and status. Yet achieving this ideal without modern shampoos, conditioners, or even reliable access to clean water required a level of ingenuity and patience that is hard to fathom. The battle against dirt, tangles, and uninvited guests was a constant and often losing one. Let's start with the basics of washing. For the nobility, washing hair was a separate and less frequent ritual than their already rare baths. When it did happen, it was an elaborate process. Servants would heat water and mix it with lye-based soap, which was harsh and stripping, or sometimes with gentle cleansing agents like boiled herbs. A mainstream historical fact is that various herbal infusions were a key component of medieval hair care. Rosemary was believed to stimulate growth, chamomile to lighten hair, and sage to darken it in cover gray. After washing, the hair would be rinsed with water, and sometimes with wine or vinegar, which acted as a clarifying agent to remove soap residue and add shine. The hair would then be painstakingly combed out and left to air dry, a process that could take hours for a noblewoman with floor-length tresses. For the peasantry, this level of care was impossible. You washed your hair when you went for a swim in the river in summer, and that was about it. The rest of the year, you relied on other methods. This leads to a fascinating and little-known detail of medieval life: combing as a primary form of hair hygiene. Combing wasn't just for detangling, it was for cleaning. People owned fine-toothed combs, often carved from bone, wood, or ivory, which were designed to scrape dirt, debris, and most importantly lice and their eggs from the hair shaft. This was such a common activity that it often became a social ritual. Women would sit together, combing each other's hair, a practice that was both practical and a form of social bonding. It was a quiet act of mutual care in a world full of hardship. Finding a louse in a friend's hair wasn't a moment of horror. It was an opportunity to help. The prevalence of lice and other parasites has fueled an academic debate. How did medieval people truly perceive these infestations? The traditional view assumed that this was just another disgusting aspect of a filthy existence that people simply accepted. They were so used to being infested that it was considered normal. However, a more recent perspective, drawing from archaeological evidence like the widespread discovery of fine-toothed combs in all levels of society, argues that people actively and constantly fought against these pests. They may not have been able to eradicate them completely, but they were not passive victims. The existence of countless herbal recipes for anti-loss potions and the sheer number of combs found suggests a society that was deeply concerned with the problem. They didn't accept lice as normal. They saw them as a persistent, unpleasant enemy to be battled daily. It's a bit of a grim joke, but a good comb was probably a more valuable inheritance than a silver spoon. When it came to styling, married women of good standing were expected to keep their hair covered in public with veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses. An uncovered head of hair on a married woman was considered scandalous, a sign of either low morals or a low station. Unmarried girls had more freedom, often wearing their hair in long braids. But even for them, looking neat was essential. To control frizz and create elaborate styles, women used a form of medieval hair gel made from animal fats or sticky plant resins. These would hold a braid in place, but would also attract dirt and become rancid over time, making the need for a good combing session even more urgent. If your own hair wasn't long or thick enough to meet the era's demanding standards, you could always resort to extensions. Hairpieces made from goat hair, horsehair, or even the hair of the dead were commonly used to pad out buns and braids. A slightly morbid but effective beauty hack. In the end, medieval hair, much like the people themselves, was a story of resilience, a constant struggle against the elements. Testament to ingenuity, and a reflection of a world where beauty was hard-won. Now that we've untangled the challenges of medieval hair, let's turn our attention to an even more daunting frontier of personal hygiene: the mouth. If you think the lack of bathing was grim, the state of medieval dental care was a unique landscape of pain, decay, and profoundly bad breath. In a world without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dentists as we know them, a healthy set of teeth into middle age was less an expectation and more a minor miracle. The daily routine for dental care, for those who practiced it, was rudimentary. A mainstream historical fact is that the most common method for cleaning teeth was to use a rough linen cloth to rub away food and plaque. Sometimes this cloth would be dipped in a simple abrasive substance like salt or powdered chalk to increase its effectiveness. Chewing on a twig, particularly one from a tree with a bit of natural fragrance like birch, was also a common practice. The frayed end of the stick would act as a primitive brush. These methods might have removed some surface debris, but they did little to combat the deeper issues of plaque buildup, gum disease, and tooth decay. This lack of effective cleaning tools led to some creative and little-known folk remedies. To combat the pervasive issue of bad breath or halitosis, people chewed on aromatic seeds and leaves like parsley, mint, cloves, or cardamom. Rinsing the mouth with wine or vinegar was also believed to sweeten the breath, though the acidity likely did more harm than good to the tooth enamel in the long run. For a toothache, the so-called cures were even more imaginative and terrifying. One common belief was that tooth decay was caused by a toothworm burrowing into the tooth. To coax the worm out, a person might inhale the smoke from burning henbane seeds, a hallucinogenic plant, which would cause tiny, writhing particles from the seed pods to fall out, appearing to the desperate patient like the worms themselves. Other remedies involved tying a live frog to your jaw or applying a poultice made of mashed beans, in the hopes of drawing out the pain through sympathetic magic. The state of medieval teeth has sparked a fascinating academic debate. Was dental health in the Middle Ages actually worse than in modern times? The traditional view holds that with no fluoride, no dentists, and poor hygiene, medieval mouths must have been disaster zones full of rot and decay. This is supported by the fact that toothaches and dental abscesses were a common cause of death, as infection could easily spread to the bloodstream. However, a more recent perspective, based on skeletal analysis, has complicated this picture. This research suggests that the average medieval peasant often had surprisingly strong teeth with fewer cavities than many people today. The reason? Their diet? It was low in sugar and high in coarse, fibrous foods like rye bread and vegetables, which required vigorous chewing that naturally cleaned the teeth. The real dental disasters began with the wealthy. As sugar became more available to the nobility as a status symbol, their dental health plummeted. In a bizarre twist of fate, rotting, blackened teeth could actually be a sign of wealth, proof that you could afford sugar. It's a grim joke, but a courtier might have envied a nobleman's aching, blackened smile. When a toothache became unbearable, your only option was the barber surgeon. These jacks of all trades, who cut hair and performed bloodletting, were also the designated tooth pullers of the medieval world. There was no anesthesia, save for a large gulp of ale, or simply gritting your teeth. The extraction was performed with a terrifying-looking pair of iron pliers, or a tool called a dental pelican, which was designed to hook onto the tooth and rip it out. The procedure was brutal, the risk of infection was high, and there was a very real chance of the jaw being broken in the process. It's no wonder people preferred to live with the pain of a toothache for as long as they possibly could. The idea of voluntarily visiting a dentist would have been utterly horrifying. Your mouth, in the Middle Ages, was a place you tried to ignore, a private world of discomfort that you masked with cloves and crossed fingers. Having explored the personal landscape of the medieval body, let's now zoom out to the wider environment. Was there a difference in hygiene between the bustling, crowded city and the open, earthy countryside? One might assume that rural life, with its fresh air and access to rivers, was inherently cleaner. But the reality was far more complex. Both the medieval city and the village were rife with their own unique hygienic challenges. Creating a world where clean was always a relative and often unattainable concept. Let's begin in the city. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval cities lacked any form of centralized sanitation system. There were no sewers, no garbage collection, and no running water outside of a few public fountains. This meant that the narrow cobblestone streets became the default repository for all manner of waste. Household garbage, food scraps, and the contents of chamber pots were routinely tossed from windows into the street below. Tanneries, butcher shops, and other industries dumped their foul-smelling byproducts directly into the city's ditches and rivers. The result was an environment of almost unimaginable filth and stench. The Great Stink wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was the daily reality for anyone living in a medieval metropolis like London or Paris. This urban squalor gives us a little-known detail about medieval professions. The raker or gong farmer. These were the sanitation workers of their day, tasked with the unenviable job of clearing the streets of filth. Rikers would move through the city with carts, scooping up the accumulated waste and hauling it to designated dumps outside the city walls. Gong farmers had an even more specialized role. They were responsible for emptying the city's cesspits and prives, a job that could only be done at night due to the overwhelming odor. It was a disgusting, dangerous, and low-status job. But it was absolutely essential to prevent the cities from literally drowning in their own waste. Now, let's travel to the countryside. On the surface, the village seems cleaner. It's the open space, the lack of industrial waste, and the proximity to nature might suggest a healthier environment. However, peasant life had its own set of hygienic issues. The typical peasant hovel was a one-room dwelling shared by the entire family and often their livestock. The floor was packed earth, and animals like chickens and pigs roamed freely inside, creating a constant source of filth and contamination right where people ate and slept. While there were no overflowing city sewers, the area around a peasant hut, with its manure pile and waste ditch, was its own small-scale environmental hazard. This comparison has led to a nuanced academic debate. Who was actually healthier, the city dweller or the villager? The traditional view long held that the countryside was a bucolic paradise compared to the pestilent city. Lower population density and fresh air, it was argued, must have led to better health outcomes. However, modern archaeological and paleopathological studies challenge this. Skeletal remains from rural cemeteries show high rates of parasitic infections, likely from close contact with livestock and contaminated water sources. Malnutrition was also often more severe in the countryside, where a single failed harvest could spell starvation for an entire village. In contrast, city dwellers, despite the filth, often had access to a more varied diet through markets and trade, and they were closer to whatever limited medical care was available. The current academic consensus is that both environments were profoundly unhealthy by modern standards, each presenting a different cocktail of risks. It wasn't a choice between a healthy life and an unhealthy one, but a choice between different kinds of misery. It's a dry joke, but you could either die of the plague in the city or a pig-borne parasite in the country. Such were your options. The perceived cleanliness of the countryside was largely an illusion, masking a different but equally potent set of health hazards. In our journey through the grimy landscape of medieval hygiene, we now turn our gaze to the stone-walled enclaves of monasteries and convents. In a world largely defined by filth and a fear of bathing, were these holy sanctuaries any different? One might imagine monks and nuns living in pristine, pious cleanliness, scrubbing their floors and their souls with equal vigor. The reality, as with everything in the Middle Ages, was a fascinating mix of advanced thinking and profound contradiction. On one hand, many monastic orders were indeed pioneers of sanitation and engineering. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries, particularly those of the Cistercian and Benedictine orders, often possessed the most sophisticated water management systems of the era. Drawing on surviving Roman knowledge, monks built impressive aqueducts, diverted rivers, and constructed elaborate systems of pipes and channels to bring fresh water into their complexes. This running water supplied the kitchens, the infirmary, and, most importantly, the lavatorium, a dedicated communal washing area. Here monks would wash their hands before meals and prayers, a ritual that was both practical and spiritually significant. Some monasteries even had indoor latrines with running water to flush waste away into a sewer system. A level of technology that was virtually unheard of in the secular world. This technical prowess leads to a remarkable and little-known feature of monastic life: their advanced medical care. The infirmary in a large monastery was often the closest thing the medieval world had to a modern hospital. With access to clean water for washing wounds and a deep knowledge of herbal medicine cultivated in their own gardens, monks were often capable of providing a higher standard of care than the average barber surgeon. They understood the importance of separating the sick from the healthy and practiced a form of basic quarantine. While they still subscribed to the flawed theories of humoral medicine, their emphasis on a clean environment, rest, and a healthy diet gave their patients a far better chance of survival than they would have had elsewhere. However, this picture of enlightened monastic hygiene has been the subject of a significant academic debate. While it's true that some orders valued cleanliness, others saw filth as a sign of piety and spiritual devotion. This ascetic viewpoint held that caring for the body was an act of vanity and a distraction from the true purpose of life, saving one's soul. The traditional historical narrative often highlighted the piety of saints who rejected all worldly comforts, including bathing. Saint Godric of Finchel, an 11th century hermit, reportedly never changed his clothes, allowing them to rot on his body. Saint Agnes was said to have never washed in her entire life. For these figures, a grimy body was a badge of honor, a testament to their rejection of earthly things. This perspective suggests that many in the religious community saw hygiene not as a virtue, but as a sin. The modern academic consensus tries to reconcile these two extremes. It suggests that attitudes towards hygiene varied greatly between different monastic orders in different historical periods. The Cistercians, with their emphasis on manual labor and engineering, were pragmatic and built impressive water systems. Other, more contemplative or ascetic orders might have embraced a more neglectful approach to the body. It wasn't a single, unified monastic hygiene, but a spectrum of beliefs and practices. It's a bit of a historical joke that one monk might be designing a state-of-the-art flushing toilet, while another, just a valley away, was proudly cultivating a new species of fungus in his unwashed habit. Both believed they were serving God. Ultimately, the monastery was a microcosm of the medieval world's conflicted relationship with cleanliness, a place where advanced sanitation and pious filth could exist side by side, each a valid path on the winding road to salvation. We now turn to one of the most perilous and profoundly unhygienic events in any medieval person's life: childbirth. In an era without knowledge of germs, sterile equipment, or antibiotics, bringing a new life into the world was a high-stakes gamble for both mother and child. The home, which was already a challenging environment for daily health, became a dangerous arena where ancient folk wisdom clashed with the grim realities of pre-modern medicine. The very act of birth was shrouded in a fog of fear, superstition, and unsanitary conditions. Let's set the scene. The birth does not take place in a hospital, but in the family's own smoky single-room hovel. The floor is dirt, the air is thick with the smells of cooking and livestock, and the bed is the same straw-stuffed pallet the family shares every night. A mainstream historical fact is that childbirth was an exclusively female affair in the Middle Ages. Men were strictly forbidden from the birthing room, their presence considered unlucky or improper. The laboring woman was attended by a group of female relatives, neighbors, and, most importantly, the local midwife. This group of women, known as gossips, provided physical and emotional support, circle of shared experience in a moment of extreme vulnerability. The midwife was the central figure in this drama. A little-known detail is that these midwives were often highly respected figures in their communities. Their skills passed down through generations of oral tradition. They possessed a deep knowledge of herbal remedies to ease pain or stop bleeding, and they knew practical techniques for turning a breached baby or managing a difficult labor. However, their toolkit was incredibly limited. They worked with their bare hands, with no concept of sterilization. Any cutting of the umbilical cord would be done with a household knife. Cloths used to wipe away blood would be simple, unsterilized rags. The risk of infection for both mother and child was astronomically high. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a postpartum infection, was a leading cause of maternal death for centuries. This reality has fueled a significant academic debate about the role and reputation of the medieval midwife. The traditional, older narrative, often written by male physicians and clerics who saw midwives as rivals, painted them as ignorant, superstitious, and dangerous. They were often accused of witchcraft, blamed for any birth that went wrong, and portrayed as incompetent charlatans. This view held sway for centuries. However, more recent feminist and social histories have worked to reclaim the midwife's reputation. This modern perspective argues that, given the knowledge available at the time, midwives were often skilled and effective practitioners who saved countless lives. They provided essential care in a world where formally trained doctors were both expensive and largely ignorant of obstetrics. This revisionist view sees the accusations of witchcraft not as a reflection of incompetence, but as a manifestation of misogyny and a professional rivalry between male-dominated medicine and traditional female healing. The debate continues, but the consensus is shifting to recognize the midwife as a vital, often maligned healthcare provider. After the birth, the hygiene challenges continued. The first bath of a newborn was a significant ritual, but the water used was simply boiled river water, and the cloths were unsterilized. Swaddling was the universal practice. Infants were wrapped tightly in strips of linen, a practice believed to help their limbs grow straight. However, these swaddling cloths were rarely changed more than once a day, meaning the infant was often left sitting in its own waste for hours, leading to severe rashes and infections. It's a grim joke, but the tight swaddling probably did more to contain the mess than to comfort the baby. In this unhygienic environment, it is no surprise that infant mortality was tragically high. Surviving the first weeks of life was a monumental achievement, a testament to luck as much as to a mother's care. In our exploration of medieval hygiene, we cannot ignore the powerful influence of the era's dominant institution, the Christian Church. The Church's teachings on the body, sin, and sanctity shaped every aspect of daily life, and its attitude towards cleanliness was a complex and often contradictory force. Far from a simple command to be clean, the Church wove a complicated tapestry of beliefs where hygiene could be seen as both a virtue and a vile temptation, and where a dirty body could sometimes be closer to God. On one hand, the Church did promote certain forms of ritual purity. A mainstream historical fact is that water held a powerful symbolic meaning in Christian liturgy, representing purification from sin. The act of baptism, a full or partial immersion in water, was the essential rite of entry into the Christian community. Monasteries, as we've discussed, often had dedicated facilities for washing hands before prayer and meals, linking physical cleanliness with spiritual readiness. Some theologians and preachers argued that a clean body was a reflection of a clean soul, and that maintaining one's appearance was a sign of respect for God's creation. The very light and airy architecture of Gothic cathedrals can be seen as an attempt to create a clean, holy space, free from the dark, earthly grime of the outside world. However, this was powerfully counterbalanced by a deep-seated suspicion of bodily vanity. This leads to a fascinating little-known aspect of medieval piety, the concept of holy filth. For many devout Christians, particularly in the ascetic and monastic traditions, neglecting the body was a sign of spiritual devotion. To reject bathing, to wear coarse and dirty clothes, and to live in squalor was to demonstrate your contempt for worldly things and your focus on the afterlife. The lives of the saints are filled with stories of holy men and women who embraced filth as a spiritual discipline. St. Anthony, one of the Desert Fathers, was said to have never let water touch his feet. St. Mary of Egypt, a penitent hermit, lived for decades in the desert, her skin blackened by the sun and her clothes rotted to rags. For these figures and those who admired them, bodily suffering and neglect were a way to mortify the flesh and purify the soul. An unwashed body was a body that had renounced pride. This duality has created a major academic debate. Was the dominant Christian influence on hygiene a positive or negative one? The traditional narrative often argues that the Church was largely responsible for the decline in bathing habits after the Roman era. By condemning public bathhouses as places of sin and promoting an ascetic ideal that valorized filth, the Church, in this view, plunged Europe into an unwashed dark age. This perspective blames religious dogma for the terrible sanitary conditions that allowed plagues to flourish. However, a more nuanced modern viewpoint argues that the Church's role was not so monolithic. Revisionist historians point out that the Church also preserved knowledge of sanitation through monastic engineering and promoted ritual washing. They argue that the Church's primary concern was morality, not hygiene itself. It condemned bathing when it was associated with promiscuity and vanity, but encouraged it when it was linked to ritual purity. The debate, therefore, is about whether the Church's moral anxieties ultimately did more harm to public health than its ritual practices did good. For the average person, these conflicting messages created a confusing landscape. Was it better to be clean and risk being seen as vain, or to be dirty and be praised for your piety? It's a bit of a joke, but you might find yourself wondering if you get to heaven faster, by scrubbing your floors or by never scrubbing your face. The answer often depended on your station in life and your local priest's disposition. In the end, the Church's influence on medieval hygiene was not a straightforward command, but a complex, and often paradoxical conversation about the nature of the body, the soul, and the eternal struggle between the sacred and the profane. As we reach the final leg of our journey through the muck and miasma of the Middle Ages, it's natural to wonder, when did things finally start to change? The shift from medieval filth to modern cleanliness was not an overnight revolution. It was a slow, creeping dawn that took centuries, driven by a confluence of social, scientific, and cultural changes. There was no single moment when Europe decided to take a bath, but a gradual, often reluctant, drift towards the standards we recognize today. The first glimmers of change can be seen in the Renaissance. A mainstream historical fact is that the renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman culture during the 14th and 15th centuries brought back an appreciation for the body and for the art of bathing. The Romans, after all, had been master engineers of public baths and aqueducts. As Renaissance thinkers and artists celebrated the human form, the old medieval idea of the body as a sinful, shameful vessel began to lose some of its power. While the fear of miasma didn't vanish, the wealthy courts of Italy began to see bathing as a sign of sophistication and refinement once more. The association of the bath with luxury and pleasure rather than just sin slowly started to re-emerge. This period also saw a fascinating and little-known development in the world of fragrance. The invention of alcohol-based perfumes in the late 14th century revolutionized the scent industry. Prior to this, perfumes were oil-based, heavy, and cloying. The new Hungary water, one of the first alcohol-based perfumes, was light, fresh, and could be splashed on the body as a toilet water. This invention, often credited to the court of Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, offered a new way to feel clean and refreshed without full immersion in water. It marked a conceptual shift, the idea of personal liquid fragrance as a part of a daily routine. This was a crucial step away from the heavy miasma-fighting pomanders of the past and towards the modern concept of perfume. The slow improvement in hygiene has led to a major academic debate. What was the primary driver of change, science or social status? The traditional argument credits the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, the invention of the microscope, the discovery of microorganisms, and the eventual development of germ theory in the 19th century provided a scientific basis for hygiene. People started washing because they finally understood that invisible microbes, not bad air, cause disease. However, a more recent social history perspective argues that the shift began much earlier and was driven by social aspirations. This view contends that cleanliness became a powerful marker of class distinction. As a new, wealthy middle class emerged, they adopted the habits of the aristocracy, like wearing clean linen and using perfume, to separate themselves from the great unwashed masses. In this interpretation, people didn't start washing because they were afraid of germs, but because they were afraid of being seen as poor. Cleanliness became a status symbol long before it became a scientific imperative. Most historians today agree that both factors were essential, a push from science and a pull from social ambition. Even with these changes, the road to modern hygiene was long and slow. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries, with the advent of municipal sewer systems, indoor plumbing, and mass-produced soap, that regular bathing became a reality for the general population. The medieval world, with its lingering fears and fragrant filth, cast a long shadow. A grim joke could be made that for centuries humanity smelled its way forward, one cautious step at a time. Today, we live in a world of antibacterial soaps, daily showers, and sanitation systems so effective we never have to think about them. We have become so clean that we have forgotten what it was like to be truly dirty. But as we look back on the medieval world, we are reminded that our current reality is a fragile and very recent invention built upon centuries of struggle, superstition, and the slow, reluctant acceptance that sometimes a little soap and water can make all the difference. As the last echoes of the clanging church bell and the distant murmur of the medieval town fade into the quiet of the night, we can finally pull our clean, soft blankets a little tighter. The journey through the grim and grimy world of medieval hygiene comes to a close. Leaving us in the sanitized comfort of our own time, we can let go of the phantom itch of wool, the imagined stench of the streets, and the bone-deep chill of a bath in a cold river. The world of our ancestors, with its miasmas and its mysteries, recedes now, becoming what it has always been, a story. A story of resilience in the face of relentless filth, of ingenuity born from necessity, and of a human desire for dignity that persisted even in the most undignified of circumstances. The lives we have touched upon tonight, the peasant, the noble, the monk, midwife, were not just characters in a historical play. They were real people who navigated a world of risk and ritual with a courage we can scarcely comprehend. Let the knowledge of their struggle be a gentle reminder of the silent, invisible comforts that surround us now. The clean water that flows from our taps, the simple soap by the sink, the warmth of a shower. These are the small miracles they could only dream of. As you drift now, let your thoughts soften, letting the harsh edges of the past dissolve into a peaceful, hazy calm. The long night of the Middle Ages is over. The dawn has come. Rest now in the clean, quiet light of the present. Sleep well.